Forget the Hollywood myths of fair fights and parrots. The real golden age of piracy was a laboratory for illegal chemical warfare and psychological terror. Did you know pirates used stink pots, clay grenades filled with sulfur and rotting nails, to choke entire crews into submission before a single shot was fired? Or chain shot designed to shred masts and limbs like a rotating iron scythe? Even Blackbeard's legendary look, with burning fuses in his beard, wasn't madness. It was a calculated psychological weapon that paralyzed the British Navy. Today, we're uncovering the forbidden arsenal that didn't just sink ships, but broke the men inside them. This is the brutal science of how a few hundred outlaws in Nassau brought the world's greatest empire to its knees. The year is 1715. Port Royal, Jamaica, docks full, customs collecting fees, merchants watching the horizon for the next convoy. News of pirates exists, but as rumors, not yet facts. In London, the Admiralty reads Caribbean dispatches 3 to 6 months old. What they see: corsairs, flags, cannons, boarding parties, the old categories. No one has written the word that would soon appear in every survivor's deposition. Nassau, New Providence, is a different kind of silence. A few hundred men in a harbor without flags know exactly what's coming. They don't speak loudly. When everyone holds the same information, there's simply no need. In the summer of 1716, a trading brig carries tobacco and indigo out of Kingston toward Bristol. Her captain has 2 guns and experience. His plan: show your flag, negotiate, buy your way out if necessary. He has read nothing describing what waits in the open water between the Bahamas and the Windward Passage. The attack comes in daylight, clear sky, good weather. The first shot doesn't hit the hull. It takes the foremast. Chain iron tumbles the upper yard down across the deck. Then silence. 2 seconds. Then the clay pots land. They don't burn. They hiss. White smoke crawls across the planks. Sulfur and something fouler. Men start coughing. Eyes water. Within 2 minutes, a quarter of the crew can't hold a weapon. Not wounded. Unable to breathe. No precedent for this exists in any shipping manual or Admiralty codebook. The vessel surrenders without a second shot fired. A survivor reaches Port Royal a week later. He tells the story at the docks. Smoking pots that blinded men. The governor of Jamaica receives the report and marks it. Witness, possibly in shock. The Admiralty in London reads it 5 months later. That dispatch still sits on the governor's desk. The sailor is in a tavern now, drinking and saying nothing. In 1 week, the port will receive news of a ship that never arrived at all. Only wreckage. And the rigging ropes, cut so cleanly it looked deliberate. Or not a blade. A chain. The wreckage came in before the news did. 2 planks of oak and a length of canvas, still tied to a sheared yard, reached Port Royal's docks on a Tuesday morning in 1716. The dockmaster logged it beneath his tide schedule. He didn't file a separate report. There was no category for it yet. By autumn, there was. The convoy system, 3 merchant vessels traveling together, was the Admiralty's standard answer to piracy. Colonial dispatches recommended it. Pirates avoided groups. The math seemed sound. The problem was that pirates had already done the math. A convoy moves at the speed of its slowest ship. In the open water between Jamaica and the Windward Passage, 1 vessel in 3 could fall 2 miles behind in a contrary wind. And 2 miles, in 1716, was more than enough. In the spring of that year, a convoy's rear ship fell behind. The first shot reached her rigging before anyone on the lead vessel heard anything. Chain shot, 2 iron balls connected by a length of iron chain. Doesn't whistle. It hums. A half second of low pitch. Then the main yard drops across the deck. The captain goes down with it. 2 men beside him. The captains of the 2 ships ahead heard the guns. What happened on their quarterdecks is not recorded. What is recorded is the report they filed in Port Royal 3 days later. Upon hearing discharge of cannon, continued on course as cargo and passage required. The Boston Admiralty Court reviewed this the following year and attached no comment. The decision was formally correct. The court was not asked to rule on anything else. The captured crew was put in a longboat, alive, with water and a heading. No records from this period expected survivors. The records suggest this was not mercy. It was strategy. Men who reached port and described what they witnessed would do more for the next capture than any cannon. Within a week, the queue outside the governor's office in Port Royal had doubled. Everyone wanted to file a claim or simply ask, "Are ships going out at all?" By late 1716, Bristol insurance houses were writing Caribbean policies with new language in the small print. Pirate conditions, listed separately from storm and wreck. Merchants read it and understood what it meant. The Crown no longer guaranteed the route. The Boston Admiralty Court Protocol from October 1717 records, "The volley dispersed the rigging and most of the starboard side. 2 crew dead before boarding, 4 during." The court's interest was not the weapon. It was whether the captain had avoided engagement deliberately. The chain shot received 2 sentences in the margin. In Nassau, there was quiet satisfaction. Every empty berth in Port Royal was a small victory, won without a fight. The reports kept arriving in London at 5 or 6 months' delay, and in one of them, set apart from the rest, was a name, not described by tactics or weapons, described by what witnesses saw on his face: smoke, rising from his own beard. London underlined it. The Commission would return to it. The London Commission underlined his name once, not circled, underlined. That's how the document survives in the Admiralty Archive. 1 line beneath a name and a margin note that reads, "See attached witness statement, Charleston." No other annotation. The witness statement describes a man stepping out of his own smoke. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, didn't invent fear. He manufactured it at scale, repeatedly, with the same components, in the same order, slow-burning match cords woven into his beard. Not burning, smoldering. The difference is critical. Fire is visible and understood. Smoke rising from a human face without flame has no rational explanation. The brain fills in what it cannot categorize. It doesn't fill in sailor with a tactical prop. It fills in something else, something older. 6 pistols on a crossbelt, worn always when boarding. 2 or 3 may have been unloaded. No surviving inventory confirms otherwise. But 6 pistols in 1717 meant 6 minutes of continuous fire without reloading. For a man closing distance with a boarding axe, 6 minutes is not a number. It's an end. The Charleston blockade of May 1718 is a documented event. Queen Anne's Revenge, 40 guns, a captured French slaver, stood at the harbor entrance for 5 days. No vessel entered or exited. A fleet of 5 or 6 fully rigged merchant ships sat in the dock, loaded and ready, and did not move. Not because any one captain was a coward, because none of them would go first. Teach took hostages from vessels at the harbor mouth, among them members of the Colonial Council. His demand reached Governor Johnson by midday. It was not gold, not the release of imprisoned pirates. It was a chest of medicine. The governor complied. The hostages were released. The medicine was delivered. And the fear that settled over Charleston after that was worse than if he'd taken gold, because no one could explain the logic. An enemy whose motives don't fit standard categories is an enemy you can't calculate. The Colonial Council had no protocol for this. There was no line in any dispatch manual that covered it. No one knows for certain why Teach shot his own navigator, Israel Hands, beneath the table one evening without warning. But when his crew asked why, his answer was recorded. "If I don't kill one of you now and then, you'll forget who I am." That is not an impulse. That is a policy. By August 1718, the king's pardon deadline was approaching. Most of Nassau had already accepted it. Teach formally received his pardon through Governor Charles Eden of North Carolina. He was, on paper, a law-abiding subject. He continued attacking ships. Governor Eden received a share of the cargo. The documents confirming this appeared later, at trial. In Virginia, Lieutenant Robert Maynard received his orders. 2 small sloops. No cannon. The Admiralty's instructions were clear. This was not a negotiation. Maynard left Virginia's Elizabeth River on November 17, 1718, with 2 shallow draft sloops, Jane and Ranger. Neither carried cannon. What they had: muskets, pistols, boarding axes, and orders signed by Governor Alexander Spotswood, who financed the mission himself without waiting for London's approval. That last detail would require explanation later, if the operation failed. If it succeeded, the protocol could be rewritten. Ocracoke Inlet on the morning of November 22nd is gray water over sand shoals under a northwest wind. Teach had been anchored there for weeks, openly, as a man holding a valid pardon from North Carolina's Governor Eden. What he didn't know was that Spotswood had already written Eden off as a compromised official. The operation was kept quiet for exactly that reason. At first light, Maynard entered the inlet. Teach's response was immediate. A single broadside, loaded not with standard round shot, but with what witnesses later described as swan shot, nails, and pieces of old iron. The volley crossed Ranger's deck. Her captain went down. Most of her effective crew was dead or wounded. She drifted out of action. Maynard continued in Jane, alone. What Teach saw from Adventure's deck was a sloop with almost no one visible on it. The logical conclusion was that the crew was finished. He came alongside and boarded. The men came up from the hold all at once. What followed lasted perhaps 4 minutes on a wet, powder-covered deck in the gray November light. Teach took 5 musket balls. Not one of them stopped him. He took cuts from sabers and boarding axes, later counted at more than 20. A naval surgeon reviewing the account noted the number was medically inconsistent with continued movement. He kept moving. He went down only when his body could no longer stand. His head was removed and hung from Jane's bowsprit before the inlet cleared. In his coat pocket, a letter from Tobias Knight, Governor Eden's secretary, warning Teach that Maynard was coming. The date on it was recent. Maynard recorded it in his report more carefully than he recorded the battle itself. Not the head, the paper. Hampton Harbor, 10 days later. The bowsprit message required no translation in any language by any captain entering or departing. Not ceremony. A posted notice. In Nassau, 3 weeks on, Woodes Rogers read the dispatch and began drafting his own list. The names on it were men still walking his streets. Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau in July 1718 with a fleet, a commission, and a pardon offer. By December, he had 2 of the 3. The fleet sat anchored. The commission bore the king's seal. The money had not come. London's Board of Trade sent approving letters, prompt, formal, well-worded. What they didn't send was the garrison reinforcement Rogers had requested in 4 consecutive dispatches. Disease had cut his soldiers by 1/3. The fort's eastern wall remained unfinished. The letters kept arriving, always 3 to 4 months behind the questions they were supposed to answer. The man appointed to end Caribbean piracy was personally near bankruptcy by Christmas. He held court anyway. December 9th, 1718. 10 men on the bench at Nassau's fort. The session was a vice-admiralty proceeding, authorized under the Act of Parliament of 1700, which allowed colonial admiralty courts to try piracy without shipping defendants to London. Rogers presided. The judges were colonial officials, naval officers, merchant representatives. None were independent. Independence wasn't the point. The point was visible, local, immediate authority. 9 verdicts. 8 sentences carried out the following morning. The bodies were displayed in chains at the harbor entrance. These men had walked Nassau streets a week before, drunk in the same taverns, bought rope and provisions at the same market stalls. The port recognized every face, but the sharpest instrument Rogers used wasn't the gallows. It was the articles. Every pirate crew signed a document before sailing. Articles of agreement, dividing prize shares, assigning duties, setting conduct rules. These papers confirmed voluntary membership. At trial, the prosecutor read them aloud. Each signature was evidence of deliberate association. Pirates had trusted their own code above Crown law. That code now sat on the magistrate's table doing the Crown's work for it. The Piracy Act of 1721 extended what the court had begun. For the first time, the crime reached beyond the act itself. Supplying pirates was criminal. Trading with them was criminal. Knowing and staying silent was criminal. The tavern keeper who sold a pirate a barrel of salt pork was now liable. The act also required merchant captains to resist boarding. Those who surrendered without engagement faced fines. A man caught between a pirate and the law now had no neutral position to stand on. By 1721, Nassau had a church under construction. Insurance rates on Atlantic routes were adjusting downward for the first time in 6 years. But one name had never appeared in any Nassau court record. He had left the Caribbean entirely, moving south along the West African coast, taking ships the way a clerk processes files. Methodically, over 400 vessels by most counts, more than anyone in this era. His name was Bartholomew Roberts, and HMS Swallow was already in the water looking for him. HMS Swallow reached the waters off Cape Lopez, on the Gabon coast, on February 5, 1722. Captain Challoner Ogle knew Roberts was anchored nearby. He also knew that a Royal Navy warship appearing directly would trigger an immediate defensive formation. So he didn't appear directly. He moved slowly, visibly, in a direction that looked like retreat. Roberts' sloop Ranger was sent to chase what looked like a fleeing merchantman. Ranger followed Swallow past the headland and out of sight of the main fleet. What came back around the point was not a fleeing merchantman. The engagement lasted under an hour. Ranger struck her colors. Her crew was taken below and locked down. On February 10th, Swallow returned to Cape Lopez and found Royal Fortune still at anchor. Roberts was on deck in full dress, silk coat, diamond cross on a chain, pistols on a belt, when the first broadside came. A piece of grape shot took him in the throat. He was dead before anyone around him understood what had happened. No last words, no gesture, no final stand. Just a man in silk on a deck, and then not. His crew demanded he be buried at sea in his full dress. Ogle permitted it. The record suggests this wasn't sentiment. A crew of armed pirates grieving a body was a more immediate problem than the burial itself. Roberts went over the side in the coat and the cross, somewhere off the Gabon coast, in water deep enough that no one has since found him. The trial opened at Cape Coast Castle, Ghana, on March 28, 1722. 272 prisoners. The presiding officer was Captain Mungo Herdman. The proceedings followed standard Vice Admiralty form, the same structure Rogers had used at Nassau 4 years earlier, the same Act of 1700. Articles of agreement were entered as evidence. Signatures confirmed voluntary membership. The court worked through the docket in under 2 weeks. 54 death sentences, 2 pardons. The remainder assigned to hard labor in African coastal fortifications. A sentence with its own mortality rate, simply deferred. 65 members of Roberts's crew were African. No charges were filed, no testimony recorded. Ogle's register notes them in a single line. They were sold. The transaction appears in the cargo column, not the prisoner column. London's trading houses received the news in April. The first response was not celebration. It was an actuary's adjustment. Atlantic route premiums dropped for the first time since 1715. 7 years of pricing in a variable that no longer existed. The Admiralty filed its summary report that summer. Stink pots, chain shot, psychological blockade, boarding axes, Admiralty courts, the Piracy Act. The whole sequence logged, categorized, and closed. What had looked, from inside it, like chaos, had a structure visible only from the outside, and only once it was finished. The era ended not at sea. It ended in a column of numbers on an insurance ledger, quietly corrected downward in a London office on an ordinary afternoon.